It's much more than the world this week. It's the world this year. Our annual look at the year gone by. The world this week, all year, in partnership with the Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey is foreign editor. How are you, sir?
Glad the year is over.
Glad the year is over.
Very glad.
All right, I'll prod you on that in a moment. Also with us is the Europe correspondent for The Atlantic, Rachel Donadio.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
The senior correspondent for Le Figaro, the French broadsheet, Laure Mondeville. Nice to see you. All right. We're also pleased to welcome Marc Bassetts, Paris correspondent for a Spanish broadsheet of record, El País, and the author, what came out last month?
Last month in November.
Otoño Americano.
The American autumn or American fall.
The American autumn, okay. It's a bit of a spoiler. We'll ask you more about that in a moment. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. Yeah, a year ago at this time, after the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump, we were bracing ourselves for a new world order. Well, today we can certify that the future is now. The inauguration of Donald Trump signaling that new world order, where America first would come up against the rest of the world the final week before Christmas. Kind of a capsule of that. Domestically, the Republicans passing what is Trump's landmark piece of legislation to date, a $1.5 trillion tax cut over 10 years that leverages the current strength of U.S. growth against a ballooning public deficit. On the world stage, the U.S. president and his secretary and his UN ambassador threatening to cut aid to U.S. members who vote against Washington on Jerusalem.
For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us. Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot.
We'll save a lot. Christopher Dickey.
What a thug. I mean, really, what a thug. What is this? I'm going to come to you and make a deal that you can't refuse. Is that what it is? It's, I think that's exactly the tone of what he's talking about. And it's also, like so much that Trump does, it's an impotent threat. This guy is a complete phony when he talks like this.
Now, this was done before the actual vote took place.
Sure. And so we're punishing the people who voted again. The vast majority, 126, I think, countries voted against the United States in the UN General Assembly. He didn't seem to quite have it straight. Was it the General Assembly or the Security Council? It was the General Assembly. And do you know what we're doing? We're not inviting those countries to the cocktail party that we're giving at the United Nations. I am sure they are all quivering in their boots. But do we think that we're going to cut off the aid to Egypt, for instance? Are we going to damage our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is so important? These are countries that voted against the United States on this resolution. And there are many, many more. Basically all of the European countries voted against the United States. So exactly what is he talking about? He's just talking.
He's just talking, but overall it's been a good week for him with the passage of that tax bill.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of his signature legislative accomplishments. What the results of that will be, we don't know. A lot of the people who voted for him may find that they have more tax return or more money back. They may find that, this miraculous thinking that if we cut certain rates, then businesses will come back. I mean, the rhetoric and the reality in a tax bill like this is so complicated. It is a good week for him, but his approval ratings are lower than ever. I was struck in that clip by his body language. He's sitting there with his arms crossed across his chest. When do you ever see a president of the United States in that kind of slouchy defensive pose?
Laure Mondeville, your former Washington correspondent for Le Figaro.
Yes.
When you think back on the year gone by, has it changed your view of America, this presidency?
I mean, it certainly hasn't changed my view of Trump. I think he's been very faithful to what he announced, and that what strikes me in this whole year, that Trump arrived as the disruptor of the political order in Washington. He wanted to disrupt the whole status quo, go against the elite. That was the message of his inauguration speech. And what we've seen is really him disrupting this order, breaking all the codes, tweeting away, and also disrupting the foreign. I mean, the way he does foreign policy is relatively new. But at the same time, what I see is, so he's answering his electorate. He's always targeting his electorate and saying, look, I'm doing what I promised. I'm doing it with Jerusalem when I move it to the embassy, when I move it to Jerusalem. I'm doing it with the climate change agreement. I'm doing it with this tax bill. I'm doing it with everything. I've promised you. I'm doing it with the immigration, that I'm starting to be much more muscular, on the border. But at the same time, one has to recognize that there is a back and forth between, on the one hand, the disruptive Trump, which is tweeting away and makes us hold our breath, and because we wonder if his ego is not going to, push him to do things that we are afraid of. And at the same time, I would say foreign policy, which is not what most people had announced. And I think one should be very cautious in measuring what is happening. I think we are in a mental fog and we don't know what is going to happen. For instance, everyone announced during the campaign and has been keeping this sort of rhetoric all along, all the experts in Washington, about the fact that Trump was an isolationist. And what we see now about the behavior of Trump is not isolationist at all. If you look at the national security doctrine he's put forward this very week by his national security advisor, it is extremely muscular. It's a very tough Republican doctrine with a doubling or, a huge amount of more money in defense, taking on Russia and China as revisionist power that we have to counter, being extremely committed, maybe not successfully, but at least he's on North Korea. He's much more active on this front than Obama was, for instance. And he's also telling us, I don't know what's going to happen, that he has a plan for the Middle East. Maybe it's a very frightening plan, but at least it is not an isolationist behavior. It's not multilateral, that's for sure. But it may be absolutely unilateral, some would argue, although he's working with China and South Korea and Japan. But it is a pretty, I would say, proactive foreign policy in the world.
Marc Basset, as another former Washington correspondent, you agree with Law?
Maybe he's not an isolationist, but he's a nationalist. And there he's breaking with an important tradition, in my view, of the American foreign policy, which was internationalist, which wanted to spread human rights, to defend some values, and the values of liberty, of human rights, etc., of democracy. Trump doesn't care about this. And he's into the tradition of nationalism, which is not exactly isolationism, but it's America First. The America First, which was one of the slogans of his campaign, and by the way, was also one of the slogans of the pro-Nazis in the 1940s in America, Lindbergh and all this crowd. This America First, I think he's putting it into practice. His foreign policy is all about America.
I think we shouldn't confuse the idea of isolationism with the fact of isolating the United States, because that is what he is doing. Whether he tries to have these bilateral relationships, or whether what he tries to do with engaging China, God knows he's trying to engage Russia. Boy, he's trying to engage Russia. What he's doing in the process by turning his back on human rights, turning his back on climate change, turning his back on so many issues that are absolutely important to the entire world, is to isolate the United States. It reminds me a lot of the Bush administration in the period of the so-called, coalition of the willing. His idea is we'll lead, we'll forge ahead, and everybody else will have to follow us because we're so damn powerful. That was the idea of Dick Cheney. That was the idea of the George W. Bush administration, and that got us Iraq. That got us a series of disasters, and that is exactly where he's going to take us, because he thinks that America is so powerful, it will lead in its own interest to the exclusion of other interests, and everybody will follow.
Meanwhile, another one of his signature accomplishments is to gut the State Department, where diplomats have been leaving left and right. Senior positions are left unfilled. Every week there are rumors about whether Rex Tillerson will leave, whether there will be a Rexit or not. He's constantly having to deny that he's not being forced out. This is another unique thing, which also affects America's standing in the world and America's relations with other countries.
Rachel Donadio, what about the Russia investigation into alleged meddling in the campaign? Is that sort of the ticking bomb in the room that is also perhaps clouding his decision-making in a way?
It's very hard to follow, even for those of us who are kind of trying to follow it every day. I think that his lawyers managed to block certain things. But yes, I mean, there is a serious investigation underway about whether the president of the United States and his closest advisors and relatives were colluding with Russia during the campaign. That has never happened before. It is a ticking time bomb, but where does it go exactly? We don't know yet.
Yeah, I think there's something that needs to be clear in this. The question is not whether they were colluding. Clearly, they were colluding. When he was reading the emails from Hillary Clinton that had been hacked by the Russians, that is collusion. Collusion's not a legal term. Complicity is the question. Was he actively working consciously with the Russians, or were people in his campaign doing that? And ultimately, legally that makes a big difference, but factually it doesn't make any difference at all. The fact is the Russians used Donald Trump to screw over American democracy, not only by getting him elected, but to discredit the process itself. And he has refused to acknowledge that again and again and again. He could have come into office a year ago, and he could have said, yes, damn it, I was amazed to discover what those damned Russians were doing, and we're going to do everything we can to find out about it. Instead, he did everything he could to deny it.
Well, let's ask the author of Otoño Americano. Did Vladimir Putin really help elect Donald Trump?
Donald Trump was not elected because of Vladimir Putin or because of the Russian intervention. But there was, we still don't know the details about it, but there was a Russian intervention, and I think it's the original sin, or one of the original sins of the Trump presidency. Trump will always have this weight on his shoulder. He did a campaign, and he sowed the doubts about what you were talking about the system, about American democracy, and the good working of the American system in this campaign. And that's the moment he got to power. Yeah.
All right. While Trump was touting America first, China's president was billing himself as the guardian of free trade at Davos. Xi Jinping, who in October was anointed as the most powerful leader his country has known since Mao at a Communist Party Congress, where no eventual successor was even designated. And if Xi seems to be in there for the long haul, so does the nuclear program of his North Korean neighbor, with one ballistic missile flying high enough to theoretically reach most points in the mainland United States. Laure Mondeville, you were mentioning North Korea, and one of the big questions is how volatile a planet is it, especially with a Donald Trump that's in the White House? Could Trump do something irrational?
I mean, I don't know if there is a huge question about North Korea, of course, and it started before Trump, one has to recognize. And he came in, and Obama actually, during their first meeting when he was leaving the White House, told him, you're going to have one huge big problem on your shoulders, and it's going to be North Korea. So, and then comes Donald Trump, and typical of Donald Trump, he thinks that the others really were not good. I mean, he has he despises actually the people who came before, because he thinks of himself, and it's dangerous. I agree with that, with Christopher, that he thinks that what has been done before is always, because they were weak, or they were too much in the system, so they didn't have this sort of potential to think out of the box, and he's going to somehow solve the problem. So he really wants to solve the problem. But the question is, so how does he do that? So I think Trump at the beginning thought, I'm going to use the fact that everyone sees me as the madman. I'm going to do this sort of Nixonian approach and say, okay, and tell the North Koreans, beware, here comes Donald Trump. If you don't bend, I'm going to go crazy, and I'll do something crazy. But I think that from the beginning, there was a game, and it was a sort of coordinated strategy with the people around him, and that Mattis and McMaster, they were actually sort of putting together this negotiation with the Chinese, pushing negotiation with securing, the sort of support of the Japanese, South Koreans, and trying to push North Korea into a corner. The question is that the North Koreans are pretty much now, everyone stays nuclear power in some way, because they practically have the capability to sort of launch a nuclear weapons. So the question is it possible to change this strategic reality? Well, and I think Trump still says that it does, and McMaster says that, and that's where I think there is some room for big unpredictability.
There's a lot of discussion going on in Washington and the national security establishment about where Trump's rhetoric ends and certain realities begin. The Atlantic, my publication, had an interview with Senator Lindsey Graham recently in which he was saying that he thinks there's a 70% chance that this could lead to a kind of military escalation.
Of course, he's no friend of Donald Trump, Lindsey Graham.
No.
Well, I interviewed Bob Gates, former CIA director and the Secretary of Defense, back in January of last year. And as we were starting to hear all this rhetoric. And in fact, it was precisely about the madman theory. And his argument was, and it was interesting from him, because I think Mattis and these guys reflect this kind of thinking, is that Obama was too rational. He was hyper-rational in a world that's not hyper-rational. And he didn't understand that sometimes you had to be intimidating. It couldn't all be kumbaya and, getting everybody together and everybody would observe their own best interest. That's not always the case. So the argument was, maybe it'd be good to have Trump shake things up. My reservation about that is, having covered the war in Iraq in 2003 and the lead up to it, I don't want to keep coming back to this, but there are parallels. All those people I heard say, we need to shake up the Middle East. Things couldn't be worse. Oh, yeah, hell yes, they could be worse.
And just briefly before we go to the break, Christopher Dickey, the Winter Olympics are coming up in South Korea. The president of South Korea has asked Trump, maybe we should ease off on military exercises. How are the games going to go?
No, I think the games will come off okay. We always have these panics about Olympic Games. You ever notice that? Remember, Zika was going to ruin the Olympic Games in Rio? There are always these issues. So I think the games will come off just fine. And probably we will dial back a little bit on military exercises.
If I can just add something about what Christopher was saying, I think that one of the, sort of uncertainties is that, recently McMaster was giving an interview, and what did he say, the National Security Advisor? He said, we are wondering what would happen. We see that the North Koreans actually are trying to put us in a situation of blackmail, telling us, now we have the capability to hit Washington or Chicago, and that means you're going to have to choose between securing Chicago or securing Seoul. And what he was trying to say is that because if we accept that the North Koreans have nuclear weapons, that means that they could actually start, incrementally trying to invade the South Koreans. And then what do the Americans do if they have nuclear weapons and can reach Washington? So there is, I think, and that's why McMaster said that's why we can't exclude the possibility of war. And I thought it was striking that he was saying that really in the open. That means that he keeps open the military option.
And if there is a war, you can kiss goodbye to Seoul altogether.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, on that cheerful note, we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching The World This Year on France 24.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
In 1976, 10 years after seizing power in the Central African Republic, President Bokassa proclaimed himself emperor. 14 years of bloodthirsty dictatorship later, France put an end to his reign. But the country has struggled ever since to establish good governance. In the face of interreligious massacres and a choice between exile or a ruined economy, some have begun to regret the passing of Bokassa's regime.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Europe Now, presented by Catherine Nicholson.
Where next for Catalonia's separatist story? We're travelling from Barcelona through Catalonia to Madrid to find out more about where the independence movement came from and what options there might be for resolving the political impasse that's rocked Spain in 2017. Join us on France 24.
Europe Now on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the world this week, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. Spain's Prime Minister says he's open to talks after Catalonian elections that return another wafer-thin separatist majority. However, Mariano Rajoy doesn't say he wants to meet separatist leader Carles Puigdemont. 2 killed in Gaza, bringing to 10 the number of Palestinians who've died since Donald Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel in Paris. The Palestinian president calls on France and the EU to play a bigger role in the region. The United Nations set to unanimously approve a third round of sanctions against North Korea, a US-sponsored resolution up before the Security Council. A South Sudanese rebel group accuses the government of attacking their base. This in the wake of the latest ceasefire deal that was penned on Thursday in Ethiopia. That deal goes into effect Sunday. France 24 will send you this exclusive report from the other side of the border with Congo. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week, or shall we say, The World This Year. Our look back at 2017 in partnership with the Daily Beast. Foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. So is Rachel Donadio, Europe correspondent for The Atlantic. Laure Mondeville, senior correspondent for French daily newspaper Le Figaro, and Marc Basset's Paris correspondent for a Spanish newspaper El País. Of course, we were talking about Donald Trump. The French didn't elect him. Yes. Cue Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the European anthem, election night back in May at the Louvre. A 39-year-old steps up as the guardian of the faith of open societies and multilateralisms. There would be more to come later that month on the sidelines of a NATO summit in Brussels. That first handshake between Emmanuel Macron and the U.S. president, where Macron making plenty of political hay out of not being Donald Trump, like when the latter pulled out of the Paris climate change agreement. And the new French president took to social media.
I do respect this decision, but I do think it is an actual mistake, both for the US and for our planet. We will succeed because we are fully committed. Because wherever we live, whoever we are, we all share the same responsibility. Make our planet great again.
Laure Mondeville, your thoughts on the... Well, he's even used the name of himself, Jupiterian president, and how he's handled Donald Trump.
I think, it's interesting that everyone keeps, sort of oppose Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. And it is true that at first sight, they are contrarians, right? You have the Donald Trump, sort of New York, from the Queens, disrupting everything, ill-mannered. And then on the other side, you have this moderate multilateralist coming from Normal Supérieur type of school, Macron, and very educated, loving multilateralism, etc. But I think that in a way, maybe they have established this pretty good contact because they have some common
They have pretty good contact, you think? Because we don't know what to make of it.
I think
There's on the one hand, there was that red carpet rolled out on Bastille Day, when Donald Trump was there for the parade.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, digs like the one you just heard, where he's obviously taking a shot at Donald Trump.
I think he does take shots because he's free, you know, as any French president, he feels absolutely free to express his opinion when he disagrees. It is a Gaullist, you know, tradition. But at the same time, there are common points. They are both disruptors. They disrupted the political order, both. And Macron is actually a much more pragmatic guy than he has been painted during his campaign. And when you look at what he's doing now, he's actually, you know, sort of moving to the right, probably because of acknowledging the reality of power. He's moving, he's on the right, I would say, economically. He's moving to the right on immigration issues. And on you could say that when he says we cannot, we have to take a burden of migrations, but we can't take the whole misery of the world, is pretty much in line with somehow with Donald Trump, even if he does say it more politely. So I think actually they are common point. And I was very struck today that he received Mahmoud Abbas at the Élysée Palace, and Mahmoud Abbas is, you know, searching for the recognition of the state of Palestine. And Macron said, no, we're not going to recognize because we're waiting for the American initiative, and it would be counterproductive at this time, exactly like the recognition of the, you know, the decision of Trump to move the embassy was counterproductive. He said he doesn't want to move in this direction either. So he's being a pragmatist, and he's waiting to see, and he said that, what the American plan is going to be. So in fact, he's a bit different from everyone is saying there is no plan, the Americans are foolish, there is no American mediation possible, but Macron is saying something else.
Macron is a centrist in a world, in a Europe, in a galaxy where it's a difficult time for centrists. Angela Merkel is weaker than she's ever been before. Look at what's happening in Britain with Brexit. In Spain, we have Mariano Rajoy of the right, who's weak, and one of the reasons why Catalonia is exploding is in part because center-left socialists are not as strong as they used to be. In Italy, there are problems in this way. So I think that maybe he's veering to the right in some ways, in some rhetoric, but the fact is he is like the last centrist left standing.
Well, and I think for me, it's very interesting to see the way he plays Trump. Because Trump is, in many ways, a very transparent figure. We know about his ego. We know about his vulnerabilities. We know how subject he is to flattery. He has his whole cabinet suck up to him in public. And Macron is perfectly willing to play that game in ways that don't cost him anything. So at precisely that moment, when Trump was looking the most isolated from his European allies, remember when he basically tried to shoot down NATO, all of his initial statements about Europe were completely nuts, and he was moving farther and farther away from Europe. Macron says, no, come to Bastille Day, something that had not been anticipated.
And gives Trump horses
and
full
give him
pomp
the whole
and circumstance
thing and
in
show
which he
all
loves.
the pomp and circumstance
Macron
for
a
you,
good
Mr.
diplomat.
President, Mr. Trump. Or Donald, as he called him several times.
Marc Bassets, what's the moment of the year that for you defined Macron?
For me, the moment was during the campaign, between the two rounds of the presidential campaign, when one day he went to this factory in Amiens, his hometown, which was closing, and there was a strike in this factory, and he had planned for a long time to go there, and Marine Le Pen, his rival,
showed up at the parking lot.
Yeah. And he went there. The climate was hostile, very hostile. I was there. There were people shouting, insulting him, and he dared to go in the middle of the people protesting, the workers, and to make the case for this centrist vision, for this globalist, some people would say, for this internationalist, liberal, open. Which it's true that Macron and Trump has some points in common, but I think ideologically they are completely opposite. Macron is the alternative, is the counter vision of Trump's America first, isolationist or nationalist vision. They have one thing in common. Macron is one of the only leaders in the world who wants to be a strong president like the American president is. I think that Macron would love to be an American president. Only the French president acts and is able to act in the way an American president does, you know, being in the Middle East, arranging everything, being the leader of the fight against climate change, etc.
Yes, I think this is true, but this is also in the French tradition. You know, all the French presidents always thought that France had some kind of universal parts to play. But I think what is interesting is sort of, I would say, the tension that we see between what he's doing inside the country, which is, I repeat, I think more on the right, and his European project, as you say, which is keeping very much, as you said, you know, sort of globalist, away from nationalism, away from the nation state type of project. And I think that in that particular, soil of European politics, I think it's going to be very tough for him to sort of make a point, because he's going contrary to the winds blowing through Europe. Yeah. I was in Germany. I came back 2 days ago. I was in East Germany, sort of researching this populist wave and what is going on with the AfD and what is happening in Germany. And I was absolutely struck by the fact that the people there, when you talk to them, they tell you, we are feeling actually in East Germany much closer to the Hungarians, the Poles, the Czech,
and
in terms of where and the Austrians, where Europe should go. Then we are actually with President Macron, who we think is a nice dreamer, and Angela Merkel, who is pushing us to some kind of catastrophe in terms of borders, migrations, etc. So I think, here we're going to have a moment of truth for Macron, I think, will be on European politics.
All right, he's already had a moment of truth this week. He turned 40. Also, Mark, on that score, January the 12th on your calendar, that's the deadline.
40 again.
that's the deadline for Germany's conservative chancellor to reach a breakthrough in coalition talks with the Social Democrats. Chris Wienicki, once Angela Merkel, assuming that this time around the talks go well, once she's back in the saddle, will Macron still rule the roost?
I don't think I think he'll be kind of a junior partner, but he'll be a very important junior partner. Look, I mean, Europe was built around the cooperation between France and Germany, just as it had been destroyed by the rivalry between the two countries before. And I think that that's going to continue, and he is willing to work with Merkel in many, many different ways. I don't think that they have wild discrepancies in the way they view the world, and economically, as you say, as he moves to the right, he's moving more and more into a kind of a rational economic policy that Merkel can live with. Mm. The problem that Macron faces on the left is that the European left, as in France and elsewhere, has been completely unrealistic about the way economies work. And they have put huge amounts of money into all kinds of solidarity and support, much of which is laudable from a social point of view, but they don't have the money to fund it. And he's right. You cannot take all of the world's suffering and bring them to France. And the truth is, nobody in France wants that to happen. There's a difference, particularly on the left, there's a huge difference between the idea of solidarity, the idea of fraternité,
and the practice.
Mm. And he understands that.
Remember when the EU used to be boring? After the Greek crisis, the Euro crisis, the migrant crisis, the Brexit crisis, this week saw the Poland crisis over a judiciary overhaul come to a head. But the first ever triggering of disciplinary action by the European Commission against a member state doesn't even rank as the EU crisis of the year. That distinction must go to Spain and the banned October 1st Catalan independence referendum that led to direct rule of the region, the arrest of some separatist leaders, another one fleeing to Brussels, and a snap election called by Madrid. On that front, good news and bad news for the Unionists. The centrist Ciudadanos party coming out tops in Thursday's poll, making big inroads, but it's the separatists who seem once again poised to form a government, those who favor independence, who will wind up with the most seats by a grand margin of 2. Marc Basset, this Catalan crisis, which the rest of Europe didn't see coming, we didn't know it would come to a head like this. It's going to be the gift that keeps on giving in 2018, perhaps.
In 2018, in 2019, in 2020, I think this stalemate will go on for a long time, because there is a stalemate. There is a stalemate in Catalan society, which is in fact divided, even if the...
Yeah, look, this is interesting. If you look at this, so 47.5% in favor of independence. That's a big margin.
It is.
And that number has barely budged for over 2 years ago.
It has, even if we looked at elections and polls before 2015, if we go to, I saw an article in my newspaper, El País, from 1999 until now, it hasn't budged. It's the same. The Catalan society is divided, and now it has been, everything has been radicalized in the last month, but there is no, it's difficult to see a way to get out of this stalemate.
Because you say it's difficult, right? But in 2015, when the Scotland referendum was taking place, and at one point the polls were neck and neck, and suddenly the Scots were there was a kind of fear of the unknown, and it wound up being a 10-point margin. In Spain, they thought there might be this kind of fear of the unknown. That didn't happen, though.
Well, first, in Spain, there was not a legal referendum, an agreed referendum like there was in Scotland, which was agreed by the Downing Street, Westminster, and the Scottish government. This didn't happen.
But it could have happened with this regional poll.
It could have happened, but every side is we can compare it with America. You have Republicans and Democrats, and it's very difficult that the Democrat becomes a Republican. Every side is on their side, and every side is having their own arguments, their own news media, their own they're fed by their own people. So it's difficult to change this. No one side will win over the other. It's very difficult. No, there won't be a victory of the so-called constitutionalists, or some people call them unionists, or the secessionists or independentistas. So there has to be some sort of agreement, some sort of politician or political party which acts like a bridge between both sides and breaks this stalemate.
The Catalan situation goes in circles. The Catalans say we want a legal referendum to vote on independence. The Spanish government says Spain has a constitution. It does not allow self-determination. We cannot hold a legal referendum unless we change the constitution. So then it becomes this showdown between utopians and disciplinarians. This election was supposed to clarify things. What it's clarified is that there's still a pro-independence majority, a tiny one. They can't offer independence because that's not possible. They can't walk back the popular sentiment. And meanwhile, Rajoy seems weaker than before, a little bit more conciliatory than he was before.
But all the parties, including the Rajoy's party, the PP, say, yes, at some point we do need to reform the Spanish constitution. So why don't they just do it?
I don't know. It seems like a dramatic step to take when Catalonia is one of many regions in Spain. Why should Catalonia get that when Valencia and Extremadura and other places...
They're afraid, to.
Well, why not? Everybody says everybody agrees, right? They all agree. Let's have a federal system.
Then,
let's have a.
We know that Spain remember?
Spain has a lot of other, potential bombs, ticking bombs in Spain. You have the Basque.
The ETA bomb stopped a few years ago.
And I think that I don't know. I think these are figurative bombs,
right.
and they are real. And I think one should take maybe sort of a wider view about what is going on in Spain, because why suddenly, or for this problem with Catalonia, isn't it that another expression of this sort of this sort of rift which is growing everywhere in the West between the governed and the governing elites, and somehow it finds an expression in this idea of independence, but it's actually a wider problem that we've seen throughout Europe and which is real. And I'm wondering whether we're not actually, I think there was this British author called David Goodyear who talked about what is going on in the West, and he talks about, the anywhere and the somewhere, and that actually the people are searching for a home, whether it is Catalonia and a region or whether it is a nation, the Poles, the Czech, even the French or the British. But and I think we have, somehow there is going to be the challenge of responding to this need for a home.
But no. Yes, there are certainly people who feel that way, but the Catalans, they don't want to be part of Spain because they want to keep their money for themselves.
It's not just about money. It's not just about money. It's about respect, and it's also wanting some kind of respect.
They have their own schools, their own language, their own everything.
This is also a region in a
respect?
country where the economic crisis in which Spain lost 10% of its GDP has again imploded centrist parties. Catalonia is a perfect example of all of these issues going on elsewhere. Filter bubbles, collapse of the center, and austerity.
Okay, Marc Basset's Saturday, it's the Clásico. It's Real Madrid and Barcelona. Do Barca fans envisage a future where they're no longer playing in the same? There's no Barca without Real Madrid, is there?
No, and no Real Madrid without Barca. So if in the hypothesis that there should be an independence, which in the short term we've seen that it's not possible in any way, they would find some arrangement. They would play in the Spanish league or in the, who knows, in the French league or in the Premier League. You know, it's not the most important and serious issue now for Catalans and Spanish. But I wanted to say we have to be careful to use the word the Catalans. The Catalans won. The Catalans say the Catalans, as we saw yesterday, are very different among them. There are a lot of nuances in the Catalan people. Almost half of the Catalans don't share the independence.
All right, so just very briefly on this, the identity politics that Laure was describing in Eastern Germany, how come it's so different in Catalonia?
There is a mix of several things, of historical grievances, of identity, of economic. I think the economic issue is important also. Catalonia is the engine, or one of the engines of Spain, who gives a lot of money to the common tax in Madrid. So I think there is a huge, very different issues which can help us to explain what happened. Identity is one of them, of course.
But the grievances in East Germany are huge, and that's why I think we are seeing a trans-Western question. You know, the Trump people, the people in East Germany, and that's why I think
how people identify with their politics.
And I think that's why Merkel is weakened.
Before we go, the silence was indeed broken in 2017. Allegations against Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein sparking the hashtag #MeToo, indignation over abuse and harassment of women. It's felled UK cabinet ministers, congressional lawmakers in Washington, TV personalities, and business executives. Before there was a Weinstein, there was the Women's March on Washington, the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated back in January. Rachel Donadio, is this the sort of the seminal moment, or is it Weinstein?
The Women's March, or in terms of... Well, I mean, I think the Weinstein scandal, which came about on the basis of investigative reporting by the New York Times and the New Yorker, happens in the Trump administration, where there is tremendous anger on the part of women, that there's this guy in the White House who has treated women so badly over the course of his career. I mean, I think that both. I mean, there's clearly this groundswell of frustration, and a certain point where women are just saying we're not going to take this anymore.
Yeah, I think even at the time of the Women's March, you would talk to people and say, and you'd look at how many women voted for Trump, knowing all the things that they knew.
45% or so.
No, they were a majority voting for Trump.
Well, in any case, lots of women
52 or 53.
Because he's a disruptor, and they felt that,
Because
and they didn't like Hillary.
They didn't like Hillary, and they didn't like Obama.
Because they didn't vote along the gender lines.
But my point is that I think we're in a very different environment now because of what's happened since the Weinstein affair with the whole Me Too movement. I think this is really changing the environment radically. And I don't think you would see as many women voting for Trump the next time around. And I think that it's going to be very problematic for lots of Republicans. One thing we have learned this year is that Trump can be Trump, but Republicans can't be Trump. When they try to be Trump, when they try and run on his platform, they lose. And they're going to keep losing. And one of the reasons they're going to keep losing is because of women and because of this kind of consciousness that's been raised by the whole Me Too phenomenon.
One of the emblematic photos that the after Weinstein period shows the day one of the hosts of NBC's The Today Show, Matt Lauer, was abruptly fired for inappropriate sexual behavior. There's a picture at NBC Studios in New York there where you see co-anchors Hoda Kotb and Savannah Guthrie embracing. And it's... Laure Mondeville, your thoughts on this picture? Because you don't know, are they embracing... because it's relief? Are they embracing because it's sad over? They're sad over the loss of a colleague. It's you don't know when you look at a photo like that one.
Frankly, I don't know because I'm not in their skin and I've never had this kind of problems. So it's very difficult for me to sort of understand what is going on. I think that there are so many emotions in America at the moment on this issue, and that there is also some irrational type of emotion, and the thing going in all directions, because there is the disgust of this sort of vertigo of things which have come up to the surface, and some of them are pretty disgusting when you look at the Hollywood world and also other places in the media,
the U.S. Congress.
Politics. But at the same time, I must say that I'm a bit feel a sort of unease about some part of this process of balance ton port and Me Too, because I think that we are the Americans have started treating all these different things in the same way. So when a guy is accused of having touched the leg of a woman and trying to seduce her during a dinner, I think it's different from sexual harassment or sexual crime. And I think that, when Matt Damon was trying to explain that in a recent interviews, he was absolutely, he was criticized and sort of trashed all over the place. And now he has been excluded from some movie because he expressed some doubts and saying at least we should be worried about who we accuse and for what, and maybe we should distinguish between the things which are happening. And I think it's very spectacular of 2017, this lack of nuance, this sort of, we are rushing to all the time to conclusions, and I think it's a very bad trend.
It's a hugely emotional and complicated time. I would not have predicted that this Weinstein scandal would happen and it would lead to Me Too. In The Atlantic, we've been reporting on how there really is this turn from kind of due process to public shaming, in the sense that you have to make a distinction between people accused of serial rape, like Harvey Weinstein, other media people accused of just bad sexual harassment and that they've faced lawsuits, to aggressive flirting. I mean, where do you draw the line? But there's a lot of confusion out there. But there's a sense, I think, certainly in the United States, maybe not in Europe, that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated anymore.
Maybe not in Europe. Just a final word on this, Marc Bassets. The reaction has been less extensive in France, in Italy, in Spain than it has been in the UK and in the US.
Yes, for the moment it's mainly an American issue, as many cultural changes start in America and after go to the rest of the world. And as happens with other cultural changes, there is a lack of, as you said, a lack of nuance sometimes, because history in this aspect is accelerating. What I think is interesting is that it's happening in liberal environments, like the movies, like the media, but we said before, the big elephant in the room is called Donald J. Trump.
All right, and we'll leave it there. We're going to finish where we began. I want to thank you, Marc Bassets. I want to thank Rachel Donadio, Christopher Dickey, Laure Mondeville, as we say in France. Happy end of the year. It's bad luck to say that other thing. But we want to thank you as well for joining us throughout the year in the world this week.